talk to each other.
Hey, I'm
So
right
that's
here.
what we're going to do today.
I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Window capture. Wizard stuff. Wow. Wait.
It says I'm right here in the call. I don't know what you're talking about. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
There we go. I must have accidentally
All right.
muted it or something. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Well, I'm here. What do you want to start with?
Well, essentially, you seem to have a complaint in regards to me sort of explaining that, well, perhaps what we can do is we can actually invest in Mexico in order to change things. And your counter argument to that was that there was corruption within the system.
There's not just corruption. There's massive corruption in the system.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you can do in order to address that corruption is provide incentives, right? I mean, it's not just like a problem in a vacuum that can't be solved.
Well, we spent literally $260 million on to help them with their law enforcement last year.
Yeah, and that was like for their migration, like to help with.
That wasn't just for migration. That was also for narcotics, for all the cartel stuff.
Okay.
And the fact that, quite honestly, it's done little to no effect should tell you something when over $250 million did absolutely nothing.
Well, I mean, like Mexico in their have like upped their efforts in order to, because a lot of the immigrants are coming from Mexico. They're coming from places like Honduras.
Yeah.
So what they've done is they've increased like patrols for immigrants and immigration checkpoints in order to sort of stifle that. So instead of investing in that, maybe invest in law enforcement policies that would work in order to stymie corruption and to try to invest in a system that would allow it so that, individuals weren't living in a poor society where gangs are running everything. That was just like my entire argument.
Yeah, well, the gangs are paying off both the police and the military, so I don't see how that's going to happen anytime soon unless we actually physically interfere.
Well, one of the things that they're essentially looking to profit. One of the people is saying that your audio is a little bit low. Let me see if I can up the gain on that. Sounds, volume mixers.
Is that better?
Yeah, that is better. Let me see if I can up the filters. I don't have any audio filters. Okay. Well, we'll keep going like this and try to see if people can actually hear you. Now, one of the things that is causing those cartels to sort of manifest is the opportunity of having being able to sell narcotics, and one of the primary buyers is the United States.
Yeah, and we're doing our part to curb that.
Well, I mean, incarcerating a vast number of the U.S. population doesn't seem to be working in that regards. A lot of like other places have gone the route of actually legalizing or decriminalizing substances, so that there's no longer an incentive in order to make it, profitable for these individuals. That's one way to approach the situation.
Yeah, and I wouldn't honestly have any problem with that, but they're still going to be there once we legalize it. As a matter of fact, they'll be the main product source for multiple years before anything would happen.
Well, right now, they might necessarily still be there, but there would no longer be a pushback in terms of them producing this product. In fact, governments would likely try to work with those gangs that would now be like sort of working towards providing a legal product to individuals. So that would sort of remove that, essentially.
Yeah, but that's not the only source of profit for these cartels at all. There's kidnapping, there's the transport over a border of people, there's just the basics of every single thing that a cartel or an organized crime family would have.
Mm. Yeah, and those are things that, you know, investment into the country could work towards stifling. I mean, if all of a sudden you're faced with a situation where a cartel is going to pay you a certain amount of money, and you decide to give, I don't know, the person job benefits and a salary boost, then they might no longer have the incentive in order to protect those that are within the cartel. They might move towards other things. I mean, these are just like one of the ways you look at these types of situations, right? You look at, well, what's the current problems in this area, and you look towards other areas that have experienced similar issues, where they had, like, you know, migrants that were coming in. Greece, for instance, decided to simply give people money. And they would take the money and go back to places like Syria in order to invest in their local economies. That's one of the solutions available as well. Well, they are bankrupt, but they can still provide solutions to current problems. I mean, they could have, like, gone the route where they had an influx of refugees, but they decided that paying people an investment and money, and, you know, providing with certain services was far more beneficial. And the same could be said of illegal immigrants that are currently in the United States. I mean, they're not necessarily providing any detriment to the United States compared to local natives.
No, they're being exploited.
Well, yeah, but that exploitation exists because they're not documented. It's not because, you know, they happen to be from Mexico or Honduras.
They didn't follow the rules of coming into the United States.
The rules, and those rules are there because essentially they were decided upon the United States in terms of, like, their border policies, but people decided to ignore that because they came from situations where it was essentially a lot more beneficial for them to ignore those rules and to come to the country. And now they're there at the tune of about 11 million people.
Yes.
So what's your solution for the 11 million people that are currently staying illegally in the United States?
I'd follow the same solution that's been going on for quite a while and just starting to look them out.
Okay.
I know it's not the most ideal solution, but you can't have people coming over your border as a porous border. That's why I actually salute building a wall as at least a symbolic suggestion that people need to start sorting their own shit out.
Okay, but that's not something that's going to occur in the current environment. If you're in a country where, like, there was this one lady that I saw, and what happened to her was her brother was killed by one of these cartels. The police aren't doing anything about it. They don't have the resources in order to do anything about it. They don't have the incentive to do anything about it. And she got, she inherited his children. And then because of that, she's making what, like $10 a day, and she needs 30. So her choice at that point in time was to essentially fail or try something different. And one of those things is to try to get an opportunity over the United States. She made the attempt, she failed, and she's looking to do it again. And this is essentially what's going to occur at every single point in time until that particular situation that she's living in has changed.
And the solution to that is to either elect new officials to turn it around, or it's just going to get worse and worse. Mexico is using us as a relief valve for their own problems.
I'm sorry, you said Mexico is what?
Mexico is using us as a relief valve for their own problems.
Well, I mean that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that Mexico. It's not necessarily just it's Mexico. By the way, they're actually working to try to stop people from immigrating over to the United States. But places like Honduras, they might necessarily not have the resources capable in order to fix that particular issue, just because the environment that they're in and the money that cartels are making over the drug trade outweighs what the government can do.
Actually, the government can actually do quite a bit. Unfortunately, they don't want to fight the way the cartels fight. The cartels have used the silver or the lead as a moniker for their own way of dealing with things. Mexico doesn't want to do that. Doesn't want to fight back against that. It'd rather take the easier way out. Especially in this.
Yeah, well,
especially in this current presidency.
Like I said, though, it's not necessarily just Mexico, though. Like Mexico is actually doing stuff in order to try to solve the problem. So it's more or less people coming from the other areas, like Honduras, for instance. That one's particularly affected. There's various pieces of journalists that have gone there in order to try to take a look at the situation, why people are moving into other environments. Like you have a local reporter that's going around and covering like 11 murders per day, and kids are just walking by these dead bodies like it's nothing. So in that kind of a situation, one of the ways to bring change, if you're actually looking to avoid, populations that are moving towards something better, because, I mean, anybody who's looking at that kind of a scenario, looking at their kids who's facing a future either being indoctrinated into the drug cartels themselves or being killed, women are, sold off to sex trade. The choice is going to be obvious. They're going to try to cross the border, and they're going to do it frequently.
Yeah.
So going the current route, which is essentially how America approached the drug war, which has been a total failure, is not going to solve any problems whatsoever. Because these are still individuals that are there that are paying their fair share of taxes and that sort of stuff, even though they're illegals.
Even if the immigrants are coming from Honduras, it is still Mexico's problem first. They will let them come along, and they can let them be a relief valve. Mexico doesn't want to handle this problem.
I don't see why it's Mexico's problem first, if the problem is sort of being exacerbated by a lot of different parties.
They're crossing their border.
Right. And they're doing so because the alternative is not a choice that they're willing to live with. That's usually why people necessarily do things and decide to look at a rule and outweigh the pros and cons and go, you know what? I think that me hanging around with like a drug cartel is not in the best interest of my family and my future. I mean, if you were in that kind of a situation, would you stay there? Or would you try to go across the border and, you know, get a job and send money back to families that need it?
Me personally, I
Mm.
would try to change. I would try to change that immediately.
You would try to change the community.
Yes.
Okay, how would you go about changing the status quo in that particular environment? As an individual who's like making $10 a day, roughly. Like you grew up and your chances of getting a school education are about 50% in terms of whether or not you complete. So you're not going to be educated.
Who says I won't be educated? There are books around.
Support structure might not necessarily be there if like one of your parents happens to have been murdered or sold into the sex trade.
You don't need a support structure to learn.
Well, you kind of need a support structure to get to the point where you can learn.
Really?
Like,
Because you can learn real quick about crime. You can learn real quick about anything.
not if you're growing up in a situation that makes it extremely difficult to do these things.
Then how come more people do it all the time?
Well, poor people do it all the time, but they're usually not going past like a very negligible echelon in terms of the scale. That's the whole thing with like wealth inequality and why people have a problem with it, because they're not getting richer. They're not just like all of a sudden up and hopping into Goldman Sachs.
I didn't say they would hop into Goldman Sachs. I said that they could do better. You can learn a vocation from just working with a person along who has vocational knowledge. You can
Right.
you can gain education from books as long as you can read. Even if you can barely read, you can just read a better book after a better book.
Okay, but still, you're still living in an environment that's not really conducive to that kind of a reality. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what their public libraries are in Honduras, but I guarantee you they're not going to have the up-to-date, you know, literary text that's going to allow you to look at social structures and be able to somehow get the drug cartels to stop doing what they're doing, because their incentive is entirely financial, and they happen to have the weaponry and the resources in order to stop you from doing that, because it's in their best interest to do so.
You're acting like I would go all Rambo on it. I wouldn't.
Well, that's essentially what you're kind of implying, though. You're saying I would try to change things. I would try to. You're sort of putting yourself in the position where this is not hasn't been attempted by the individuals who are already currently living there, and B, having failed to do so, have just decided to take their chances at the border.
Actually, it's been attempted quite a few times.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger problem is that most of the people who are there like to ruckus and over the top, which is why they suffer fairly badly. You have the unfortunate part of vigilante groups starting to arise all the time in Mexico now because they're tired of the government not acting. I believe it was I think a month or two ago they actually ousted a mayor in a local city for not looking for murderers in I can't remember the name of the city.
Right. So, I mean, that route is something that has been attempted, and so far we're still seeing the same results. regardless of people's like will to want to change things. Because I'm sure every other person would like it if their current environment was a lot more conducive to their well-being. But I mean, these are impossible situations that people are living in.
They're not impossible. Things are going to get worse before they get better, though. It's going to get to the
Yeah.
point, it's going to get to the point where the U.S. is going to have to intervene sooner or later, and when that happens, it's going to get even worse.
Well, the United States currently is just trying to go about doing it in a way that's not really addressing the problem. It's just essentially shifting people in another location and then going under the impression that people are not going to make the attempt again in order to get into the United States. Because people are crafty. There's a reason there are individuals called coyotes that are there specifically to try to get individuals into the United States. It's because it's far more beneficial for somebody to go to the United States than to stay in their current environment. Like one of the mothers from one of these things said it's not worth the risk, but there's no other option. But they're well aware that they can die during the trek from Honduras over to the United States because of the individuals that they're meeting and they're dealing with are not exactly looking out for their best interest either.
They aren't. They're part of the cartels as well. Almost all the coyotes are part of cartels. And smuggling in itself has a lot of horrible actions itself.
So, I mean, I don't see how my particular solution has been rebuked at this point in time, just because. I mean, you seem to have a general approach that it's just not going to work.
You can't just throw money at a problem and say everything's going to go good. It's not. Most of that money is going to go to the cartels because they'll pay you.
Yeah, no, I agree that's a possibility that can occur, but you can essentially correct for that. I mean, I'm sure in other situations there were opportunists.
How'd that correction work in Iraq?
Well, I mean, it didn't work very well in Iraq, but there are definitely lessons that were to be learned for them. But it did work for other countries like Japan, for instance. So maybe you take a look at what happened in Iraq and what happened with Japan, and you go by. You play like, what's that?
Japan wanted to rebuild itself. Mexico right now doesn't. Its ruling class does not want to do anything except line its own pockets. You have chances with at least a couple of the candidates in Mexico's new election, but you probably should put your hopes up.
I don't think Japan wanted to surrender. I think it was the fact that there was 2 very large bombs that were dropped on them, and facing that reality of that happening to their other populations.
That's not what I said.
Happening.
That's not what I said. I said Japan wanted to rebuild itself.
I'm having a difficult time hearing you. Let me see if I can fix that. Everything's at high levels.
I said Japan wanted to rebuild itself. Mexico right now.
Japan wanted to rebuild itself.
Mexico right now is owned by the upper class, and right now it doesn't want to fix itself. It just wants to line its own pockets, and it doesn't matter what the cartels do, because the cartels are actually paying for most of the candidates themselves. As you can see, they murdered, what was it, 120 out of the elections. But sooner or later. But sooner or later, this problem's going to have to be fixed, and unfortunately, it's looking more and more like the U.S. is going to have to help fix it. it's
Yeah.
not gonna be through money. It's going to be through probably military help.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a military. It could just be a financial one. You provide financial incentives. You look at candidates that are essentially principled, that are rising up within the ranks. I mean, it happened in various different locations, like in South Africa, for instance, where you had like Nelson Mandela, who came to be. There's always individually people are looking to rally behind that can change the status quo. And I'm sure within that environment of fear, if you provide or you put out feelers, you can start to understand who the players are. I mean, we have a central intelligence agency, for one, that could essentially provide that kind of information and documentation. You work towards the individuals who are looking to improve the status quo rather than defend it.
I'm sorry. Are you telling me that you trust the CIA to tell us who's good for Mexico?
Yeah. Why?
You're talking about the CIA who's performed how many coups right now?
Yeah. No, I understand their history, but I mean, they still are the body of power in the United States that can provide intelligence about foreign institutions. And I'm sure that there has been instances where their existence has actually been beneficial to the United States.
Yeah, if you trust the CIA, basically you're trusting a person that's going to help the U.S. and probably belittle Mexico.
Well, that's usually how it works. When you have like a government institution that's paid for by the government can essentially get briefings, like if you're the president, for instance, from the CIA, and you sit down with people from the CIA and you say, look, we have a real problem. We need some solutions in these kind of information, in these kind of situations, and we need information on who the key players are, who would be looking to work with you, with Mexico and Mexicans in order to improve upon its certain complications with cartels and that sort of stuff. I mean, it's not something that they're going to go, okay, no, you know what, we're just going to go and do our thing instead.
I hate to tell you, but the CIA is probably not the best person to look for that kind of stuff. You might have to look at humanitarian organizations for that. You don't want to trust the CIA for this kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other intelligence organizations that are in the United States that deal with foreign bodies like the CIA does. I mean, that is kind of their specification.
Don't trust an intelligence agency to tell you what is best for another country. They're going to look exclusively for themselves. Like I said, try a humanitarian organization. They'll know the local leaders on the ground who are willing to help.
Right. I mean, that's another organization that you could look towards information, or you could use the entity that is essentially primed in order to offer you intelligence about individuals who are operating such cartels and that sort of stuff, and providing that intel over to local governments and allies who have been deemed to be trusted. I mean, I'm sure humanitarian organizations are not going to be able to get the kind of intelligence necessary in order to be able to gather that amount of intelligence. But I mean, if you have a general distrust with the CIA, I don't know what to say in that regard. It's kind of a thing that the United States has that they use, just like a lot of other countries.
And it will not go well for Mexico. It will actually go bad for Mexico. Give it 10 years and Mexico will start going the same way.
Well, I disagree, because it's not really like, well, why would it go bad for Mexico? Just because it's the CIA and that's what they do? They fuck shit up.
The CIA puts puppets in power for the U.S. themselves. They don't
Okay, well,
help other countries. I mean, CIA coups. I mean, um, Maduro is one of the best ones to, oh, not Maduro, the Egyptian dictator that was out.
Well, one of the things you could actually do is just go about it in a different method. Instead of installing puppets, you install people who are, how do I say it? They're loyal to their country, and you don't try to usurp their interests by, getting it to align with U.S. interests. You put the state of Mexico first, because if Mexico is doing well and starts working with the United States towards the other areas like El Salvador and Honduras, then that can lead to a beneficial partnership in terms of economics. Because currently, right now, the plan is erecting like a wall that costs about $70 billion. I just feel that money could be used otherwise. I don't think that's stupid.
Once again, I keep on pointing out, you're trusting a government organization that has no interest in what Mexico needs or wants. It's a group that quite literally has been known to do a lot of scummy shit, even in Obama's administration.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's essentially your opinion of the organization, and I haven't really looked into it personally. But I will. And the argument to that is, if there are those things that are occurring within the CIA, then it is a government body and is therefore beholden to that government, and should be. So you work towards making the organization into something that you want it to be, that can benefit your own country. Because if you're saying that, well, the CIA is an organization that doesn't have the best interests of Mexico in mind, and therefore the best interests of the United States, then reformation within that environment should be something people look for, I think.
Yeah, that has not gone well. You got to remember, the CIA in the 70s to, I believe, early 80s was actually shipping cocaine into the U.S. So, at least a supposed rogue agent part of the CIA. And that led to, I believe, 3 arrests, and that was about it. And, like I said, numerous coups, many overthrows of governments that were semi-attached to the United States and could have been beneficial to the United States. I mean, we had the Shah of Iran that was brought in by the CIA and was thrown out by a government that has been a thorn in the U.S. side ever since.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. I can't speak to the accuracy of anything like this. I don't have that much knowledge when it comes to like the CIA and how they operated with other governments in the past. But that's essentially the general consensus, is that they haven't been entirely transparent in regards to their policies and in terms of how they want to influence other entities. But I mean, if there was a change to be made with that, and they were to work in the capacity that I suggested, that might necessarily, work towards benefiting those various locations as a whole. I mean, instead of using intelligence to try to install puppets and have a country do your bidding for a very short amount of time until the dictator decides, you know what? Fuck these guys. Maybe go about having an environment that's conducive towards the population that can be a partner to the United States, and therefore, start open trade relations, do some free trade, and that just benefits everybody, across the board. Anyways. So I'll leave you with the final thoughts on this. I don't know if you had like any other points of contention.
Well, first of all, I'm not a NAFTA guy, so I'm looking forward to NAFTA falling down as it is because I'm a protectionist. So
Sounds good. So yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on and having a discussion.
it is what it is. I honestly didn't know why you wanted me on because I had no videos on before you challenged me. So
What was that?
I said I didn't know why you wanted me on in the first place, seeing that I had no videos on or anything until you challenged me.
Well, it's because you had specifically challenged what I had to say, and I figured that, like, you know, instead of like doing it back and forth on Twitter, you might be able to have a conversation about it, and people can, you know, listen to two different points of view and come up with conclusions and continue the discussion from that point in time. Because, you know, it's not something that you really think of until like the problem's right there in front of you.
Well, to be honest, I thought you were going to call me the straw man, that guy that was on the Raven Ruins Discord, because it seems like everybody's been calling me that lately.
No, usually when I invite people on, I just come at it from a neutral position. I don't care what you've done.
Well, I'm not that guy. That's what I was saying. I thought that.
Oh, okay.
I was a socket count or something, but that was all.
Sounds good. All right, dude. Well, thanks for coming by. Take care.